Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome one, welcome all. We're going to start in a minute. I'll give people the opportunity to come in, and we'll start.
Let's see if we can wind that
Okay.
back. Whoops. Okay. Don't touch.
Fiddly fingers. Might give it one more minute for people to assemble. I'm sure traffic has been hellish around the center. Okay, I think we'll make a start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar brought to you by the good people at the Society of Light and Lighting and CIBSE. My name is Guy Kornetsky. I am an SLL event committee member, and I will host today's webinar. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping notes. If you experience any technical difficulties with hearing or seeing the webinar, first try and open your eyes. We otherwise recommend leaving the session and logging back in. You know, the old turn it off and back on again. As always, I invite you to stay with us to the end, because after the presentation, there will be an interactive discussion with our speaker. And therefore, I also encourage you to post questions throughout using the chat function. However, unlike most speakers, our guest today will invite everyone to share questions during parts of the presentation. I will filter those and put them forward at opportune moments. So we will get through as many as we can, of course. So please put your questions through. As you probably noticed, we are recording this session, and a link will be sent shortly after we finish. And finally, if you would like to know more about the Society of Light and Lighting, please visit the website www.sll.org.uk or contact sll@cibse.org. Now, as some of you will know, when I introduce our speakers, I like to open with a little story. So when I was a kid, I loved playing imaginary games, you know, make-believe. It was great. I had complete creative freedom. How often do you get that? But no matter what world I ended up creating, inevitably, I would have to choose one of two approaches. Either I could be a lone wolf, in which case I could say things like, I work alone, and be all brooding and hide inside my long trench coat. It was my dad's trench coat, so of course I literally hid inside it because it was too big. Or I could pretend to be part of a team, in which case I could wait for the question, you and what army? Then smile knowingly as my imaginary team gathers to back me up. Teams are everywhere. Your family is arguably your first team. Your friends, are your team too, of course. And at work, we are part of multiple teams, either as team members or perhaps as leaders of teams. Being part of a team can be great fun, and it can also be quite challenging. So today we thought we would focus on something a little bit different. Instead of talking about the lighting profession, we would talk about the professionals, the people, and not just in lighting, but across the entire built environment. How can we become better team members and better team leaders? How can we make teams perform better and be more enjoyable? Luckily, our guest speaker today knows all about teams. In fact, he has made it his career passion and focus for over 25 years. David Webster is a highly experienced and well-regarded chartered occupational and coaching psychologist and founding partner of the Center for Teams. Some of David's current and past clients include Brandwatch, EDF Energy, Starbucks UK and Ireland, BP, the British Red Cross, the NHS, and BBV HS2, as well as various other international companies. David has also published a book called Creating Adaptable Teams: From the Psychology of Coaching to the Practice of Leaders, which is well worth your time if you want to optimize yourself and your team. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you are paying attention, because the next hour or so could transform the way you work. David, thank you very much for joining us today. Over to you. You're muted, I think.
That's because there was an Amazon delivery a moment ago, so forgive me.
Excellent.
I thought it was a lovely story right at the beginning, and in a sense that's where I started my journey with teams a long time ago, in sport. And I think that's often where people do have their first contact overtly with teams and being required to play and engage with others in order to either get stuff done or to enjoy a good game. But of course, families are, as you say, the start of our ability to engage effectively and work and engage effectively in a family, to do family things. And that's where we learn all sorts of things, like how we deal with conflict, whether it's okay to speak up, whether we're more selective about the people that we want to be with, because you can't select your family, but you may not like them either. Or you may be, always want a lot of people around you, and a big family then follows. So families are a really good resource. And looking back at your relationship with groups of people, I think is a very instructive process when you come into the workplace and need to engage professionally with each other. So thank you for that very generous introduction. What I'm going to do now is challenge myself technically and share some slides. And I've got a pattern for what I'm going to share. But as you say, Guy, there'll be moments, not necessarily obvious moments, but moments where the assembled throng, you guys out there, will have questions. Do please, as you go, whenever you think of them, just pop them in the box there. And Guy, you're going to be kind of filtering out the ones that are going to spark some good conversation, because it's easier to generate insight, I think, through conversation rather than just from me saying things. I think the conversation is very helpful in that regard. So I'm now going to share the slides. So here we go. Guy, my assumption is that you can see that. Give me a thumbs up.
Yes, we're good. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is share what we're going to be talking about. And I'm going to do a brief introduction to my world, so you know a little bit about me and where I'm coming from in what I'm saying, and try to connect that to your world, because I suspect there is lots of similarities, even if the industries themselves are different. Next, I'm going to share 6 questions, which I think are pertinent not just to leaders of teams, but team members, participants. And I think they're very common across a whole variety of different kinds of organizations. And they come from the individual, but they also get talked about in a good team amongst team members as a whole. So those are the 6 questions which we'll briefly be running through. And then finally, I'm going to bring everything together in one of the principles that we hold dear when we support leadership teams, management teams, and project teams, as we do, and that's to slow down to speed up. And the whole idea of being able to slow down to speed up is to do what your mother used to say, and that's pay attention. It's to notice what is happening around you and the way that you're engaging in a team with each other, and to course correct, to adjust, to learn, in order that what you're going to do is better than you otherwise would have done. So that's the pattern, 3 sections really, and an opportunity, as I say, to pose questions throughout. So let's crack on with that first bit. This is a bit about me. These are the kind of clients, as Guy was saying, we work with, and we work usually at a senior level, chief executive and executive directors, but also the leadership teams of those executive directors out in the field. And those folks often have to engage with people who are contractors, contractor teams, and sometimes those contractor teams are part of their leadership team over time. So particularly if the contract's a long-term one. And we also work with project teams. So oil and gas is a good example of that, but also in high tech, high growth, high tech businesses. Essence is one of them, part of WPP, the advertising agency. Brandwatch is another that harvests intelligence from social media for big brands. And they work in much smaller groups, but those can be lasting only perhaps a week or a month or 2 months in order to get something done. So being able to support those folks feels like it might be a different kind of proposition because the timescale is different, but the pattern of teamship is exactly the same. And these questions, I think, are a good support for all types of team environment. Ages ago, I was so interested in teams, and my interest in teams, as Guy indicated, went back quite some way for he and for me as well. Not just from family, but through school and sport. And I was very keen on rugby, and then became a consultant, as I now am, consultant coach and psychologist. And I was interested in this question: what does a team need to do over time to be effective? And I did study teams in the oil and gas sector, both client side as well as consultant side. So both long-term leadership teams as well as temporary project teams. And what came out was the model, the adaptable team framework, which I'll share today, that forms the basis of the questions that I'll be posing. So it has come from both primary as well as desk research, secondary research. And it's also come from professional interest. And this is me holding, I pulled this out, this is quite some time ago now, but I went out to New Zealand with my colleague on the left, Miles Downey, to work with New Zealand rugby. It was a highlight of my career. And there I am holding the Webb Ellis Trophy, which for those who don't know is the Rugby World Cup, the Rugby Union World Cup, which at that time was in Wellington, New Zealand, in the very large trophy cabinet that the All Blacks have. In the picture on my right, it's just to my right, and it was rammed full of all sorts of awards that they won. They're winning less awards at the moment, so this is perhaps less applicable, but it was a real moment of pride. And part of why I'm passionate about teams is that they're endlessly fascinating. Their context is always changing, and what the teams need to do is constantly being challenged, so they have to adapt. And in rugby, as in leadership teams and project teams, the individuals are always changing too. In fact, those teams as an entity may fall apart, disintegrate, or be disbanded, and then need to come back together again with different people for different purposes. So the world is constantly changing. So I hope what I have to say is applicable for you for those reasons. Not just because I'm connected in part to the industries in which you are connected to, but also because I've got this burning passion to support people to be effective in a team right from the start, even if the team is not going to last very long. So I have a question for you, and this perhaps might cause the first opportunity for some questions or conversation. On the left-hand side there, you have a team in name only, and on the right-hand side, you have a real team. So on the left-hand side, one that perhaps you might not want to be part of, and on the right-hand side, one that would be compelling to you, that you'd want to be part of. And it's divided into what team meetings are like and what happens between team meetings. And as you can see, the one on the left, Team A, not a happy place. So there's a feeling of irrelevance, can't wait for the meetings to end because they're so utterly dreary and pointless. And the leader battles to keep everybody together and orientate them at best. And there's a sense in which the dynamic, the underlying unspoken forces at work are really driving the team, and not necessarily everybody being driven in the right or the same direction. On the right-hand side, though, you have a team that has real energy and a sense of purpose and meaning in its work, and acts proactively to be able to address challenges before they become big issues, and are clear about their own accountabilities individually and collectively, and don't rely on the leader to get things done and to do the integration. And a much more productive place where performance is greater and performance can be sustained over time because people are happier and they're learning and engaging effectively with each other. So the question at the top there, which team is more like yours? And I recognize that you may be part of a whole variety, a number of teams, but if you pick one team, where would you put that team, A and B? And perhaps in percentage term, how much time do you spend, like 50 and 60, 70, 80% in teams on the right, which, you know, it's going well, teams on the left, A or B? So Guy, I don't know whether we're picking up some commentary or observation or even some questions in response to this slide, and I'll keep this slide here. Any thoughts?
Thanks, David. Let's see. Give people time to reflect, I suppose.
Okay.
And it's interesting. If are you able to share the slide, David? So we can.
Yes, sure. Sorry.
That would be great.
Take it away from you. There you
go. Yes. So Brandon is saying it almost feels like Team B is the ideal. We should all be Team B. Team A, nobody wants to be in. But if one is able to be honest with oneself, to say, actually, either my team or I know someone is in a team like Team A.
Yeah.
We have a comment saying that someone,
excellent.
which is great. I also wonder, given that some of us, as we identified, are part of an internal team, and then we work with, or we collaborate with external teams on a project, I wonder whether it could be both. You know, one team is one, but then the other.
Absolutely, yeah. Hence the percentage question.
Yes.
And I think in my experience, even if your home team is an A, and sometimes that's the case, you may find it's much more rewarding to spend time in other teams that you're part of. So teams that are B, the real teams. And that really skews the time that you spend, which was inferred by one of the comments in there. And it means that your role is distorted. Because if your primary role should be with team A and you're spending more time in team B, then you're not going to be as productive. And your contribution is not, the required contribution is not going to be as clear to yourself or others. So there's something about being clear on which you're in and how to create more of an opportunity for real team to emerge, for B to really be much more prominent in your day-to-day activity.
Yes, and if someone may feel despondent that, looking at this in the cold, harsh light of a slide, if one feels, actually thinking about it, I think I'm more team A.
Yeah,
it may feel rather challenging and disappointing. In a way, that could be a positive, to be able to identify where you're at, that maybe there is work to be done being part of team A.
Yeah,
there is an opportunity to grow there, maybe.
I think, and what we're going to talk about in this next chunk is really that it's not just the leader's responsibility to move from team A to team B. It's everybody's responsibility. And leaving power dynamics aside, which can block you from speaking up and saying, actually, we need to do this, we need to get clear on that, and we need to have these conversations. Leaving that aside for a moment, because that can be a powerful trap. I think having the language to be able to say, actually, I think we need to address this question is really the key. And that falls to everybody, because nobody wants to be unproductive, but mostly people want to belong. They want a home, and teams provide the home. And that's why I think they're the bedrock of performance in any organization. And performance is not just about delivery and output. It's also about learning and enjoyment and providing meaning for the people who are there. So I'm going to move us on now. The story does slightly continue.
Yeah. In summary, it feels like people feel like they're part of both at various
times,
points.
And it can be dismal if you get stuck. And one of the mantras that I have comes from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where Sundance says, "I'm better when I move," and he's talking about drawing his gun and shooting things.
That's right.
But the analogy, I think, bears out. I think we're all better when we move. If we get stuck, we can learn things, but we've got to use what we learn. And that applies particularly in a team, because a team can get well and truly stuck, and it means that the leader has a real challenge on their hands in moving the team forward to greater performance. So I'm going to move us on. The thread of the conversation continues, because what happens when you get stuck is enjoyment and meaning start to decline, and you start to feel a bit like this. And soon after not really enjoying things and finding things a bit kind of meaningless, shortly after that, your learning starts to decline, which, if you're seeking to drive a career, is not just disappointing, it's a showstopper. And of course, your ability to perform declines over time too. You may be able to sustain it for a bit, but not for any length of time. So this next section is about these 6 questions. And in the lead-up, I'm just going to share a very simple framework that we've developed that came from the research that I talked about earlier on, that we put into a framework called the Adaptable Team Framework, because it's our belief that teams' ability to adapt effectively to their context, and for team members, even if they're in a temporary team, to come in and be effective and contribute really well and very quickly, is at a premium in today's modern organizations. It is not possible to do things alone. That's why the word company can be so instructive. We work in companies because having company means that you can get stuff done more effectively. So this framework then is called the Adaptable Team Framework, and it looks like this. It's a bit like a speedometer in a car, and each of these segments, as we go through them, has a question that's attached to it that individual team members ask, even if they don't ask it out loud. And I think leaders can usefully pay attention to, because this is what is going on inside the minds of those folks who you've assembled. And an opportunity also to think about this model in terms of a left hand and a right hand. The stuff on the left hand to do with purpose and dynamics very often is unspoken, unsaid, unseen, even the stuff on purpose. And I say that because purpose can be a very personal thing, because it's connected to the meaning of the work that you do. And if you don't have a sense of meaning, and many of you will know this already, given the conversations now that we're all having about effective mental health management in organizations, as well as personal mental health management, you have to have a sense of meaning in this case, the work that you do. And that's connected to the purpose that you've gathered as a team. So that has to be clear. And often it's not clear. It's not spoken about. Why are we together? What are we doing here? And what are we seeking to achieve? And is that something I buy into? Is it meaningful? The next one is dynamics. And that's the underlying dynamics of the team, which we'll speak about again shortly. Then there's action, which is on the right-hand side. And there's a distinction between the right and the left, which I'll just reinforce. On the left-hand side, you have the inner world. On the right-hand side, you have the outer world. So it's actions that you can see and it's results that you get. And in a sense, we spend a lot of time on the right-hand side. Even the learning that we do, supported at the top by some kind of learning rhythm, which again, I'll talk about later on, and the leadership, both individual among team members as well as from the leader, all of those things can keep us in simply adjusting the actions in order that we get a slightly different, hopefully better result. But of course, the performance has its real source in the inner world, how people are thinking and feeling about their work. So let's move on to these 6 questions. Here are the 6 questions. They are: why are we coming together? Is this a safe place to be? How will we work together? What does success look like? And then 2 additional ones, as you saw from the model in those single words: what is the leader's role and how will we learn? So those are the 6 questions. And I'm going to go to the first one first and move through each of them reasonably swiftly. And then I'll probably pause halfway through after, say, 3 of them. And if there are questions, Guy, we can take them then. So I'll go through the first 3. So the first question is, why are we coming together? Now, I talked a little bit about this already. People need a sense of belonging, a home away from home, a place in which they can live out their sense of personal purpose and meaning. Now, it's a real sweet spot if that coincides with the work of the team. But it's not just the work that gives them that sense of meaning and purpose. You can't just rely on your professionalism as lighting specialists to give you that sense of meaning, although that is a source. It's also through the people that you work with, the collaboration. Is it striking the right tone? Are we going in the right direction? And do I feel that's compelling and rewarding? Because we've all been in teams where actually the work is the same as the team that I was in last week, but it doesn't feel nearly as meaningful. For some reason, there's something missing. And often it resides in clarity of purpose. Why are we coming together? Because if you're not clear, you're going to end up as an A team rather than a B team. So that's the first question. And part of that, for those who like a good read, is connected to the reason why we go to work in the first place. And for those who are interested in this kind of thing, Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, wrote an extraordinary book. He's a psychologist and went on to write many more and become a famous academic. Wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning about his experience in the death camps. And why was one of the questions that he needed to wrestle with early on in his time in that experience. You can put up with almost any kind of how as long as the why is clear to you. So meaningful work is right at the core of a team's life. The next question relates to dynamics, and that's, is this a safe place to be? Now, if you've got teenage kids or younger folk in your family in their 20s, 30s, they'll be much more used to this language than perhaps my generation. I'm in my 50s now. And people do talk about, is it a safe space? And that's very interesting because the academic research is very clear that trust has to be in place for a team to be successful. You don't get anywhere without it. It won't win you the game, but it'll certainly lose you the game if it's not present. And there are lots of different aspects to trust. And part of that is what is now known as psychological safety, which is why I phrase the question in this way. Is this a safe place to be? Can I speak up? Can I say when I don't know how to do things? Can I say when things have gone wrong? Either that I see in my work, or more importantly, perhaps often, you see things going wrong in somebody else's work. And is it a safe thing to do to say, actually, we've got to have a look at this? Or will you be browbeaten down, ignored, sidelined, and people show massive disinterest? And if that's the case, the chances of you speaking up again when there is something mission critical to say is significantly less. So is this a safe place to be is a central question, particularly for leaders, but I think it's also incumbent upon team members to generate that safety. And I've got a couple of slides here that lead you to hopefully some useful conclusions on that. And this one really reinforces the idea of psychological safety, which is defined by Amy Edmondson, who's one of the leading American academics in this field. Describes it as a shared belief that the team is safe for what she describes as interpersonal risk-taking. And the research that she has done over the last 6 or 7 years is very clear. Teams with a high degree of psychological safety perform better. And that's because a whole load of reasons on the left-hand side. It encourages learning. You can innovate, you can make better decisions, you can plan more effectively, you're more coordinated. You can bring in difference and diversity and include that kind of innate intelligence and observation that's so useful in making effective decisions. And this can be in a short time, limited time project team or in a leadership team. So how do you go about building it? Well, this is instructive, again, both for leaders as well as team members. Firstly, be trustworthy yourself. Be worthy of other people's trust. Turn up on time. Do what you say you're going to do. If you can't do it, say you can't do it. Simple things like that make a massive difference to your reputation of reliability. Keep confidences. Things like that make a massive difference. Build your own confidence in speaking up. And if you're the leader, and you see somebody wants to speak up, bring them in. And I think it's incumbent upon both parties to make that happen. Supporting boundary creation is good for the team. I think setting a tone and the things that are important to the team in its behavior is very helpful. And in your organization, you may have values and descriptions of what is helpful behavior and what's unhelpful. Use those things, actively use them, because it makes people feel safer. It reduces anxiety and means that people are much more likely to speak up. Fourthly, back each other up. So when you're in a public forum and you've made a decision together and that you've all agreed to stick to, don't start dissing each other and falling apart, because that will fundamentally damage one's ability to perform effectively as a team. It damages trust and it damages safety. Be curious. So if there's something that comes in from left of field that you feel is quite challenging, get inside it. Don't reject it out of hand. I think we get caught in bringing things closer to us or rejecting things, rather than in this kind of midway that's really interesting you say that, because I didn't experience that at all. I wonder what's going on there, that we're seeing it in a very different way. And that can defuse what can escalate as conflict, either about the task or about interpersonal relationships. Next up, it's giving and receiving feedback. That's a regular one. And one of the things that I think organizations generally do not very well. And lastly, check expectations and negotiate how you're going to work together. And that comes on to the next question. So I'm just going to pause there because it feels like a good opportunity to come in with some questions, if there are questions to be had, or even observations on what you've seen. So we talked about those first two bits, which are kind of below the waterline, if you like, or to the left-hand side of the dial, the inner territory. Any thoughts on the questions that I posed and the kind of conversations that you have? And do you have questions that are going to be helpful to us in generating more of a conversation here?
Thank you, David. Again, we'll maybe give people a minute or so to reflect. Brendan asked, was wondering, don't we have to encourage people to speak up, or are we concerned of the consequences of speaking up?
Well, I think you put your finger on the reason that people don't, and that's that they fear the consequence. And that fear can come from other situations they've been in where they've been beaten down when they've spoken up, which has nothing to do with the team that they're in. Could be in a different organization entirely. But if that's their experience, that can stop them. But it's, of course, particularly powerful if it's in that same team and the history and the consequence doesn't look good for the individual. So the more that can be encouraged, absolutely, Brendan, the better. And it is situational. Sometimes the stakes are very high and everybody's very anxious, in which case you need an even higher degree of trust and psychological safety. But it's incumbent upon the team to generate that together and to stay curious about perhaps why there isn't as much conversation as there need to be. And challenge is very difficult to implant.
Thank you, David. Another question, how do you encourage this type of behavior when people are under pressure? It takes brave leaders to ensure this happens. Pressure makes people revert to type, to a certain, stock behavior, I guess.
I think firstly, it's know your type. So if you're going to be doing high stakes work together for some time, for some length of time, invest the time in getting to understand more about yourself and your response to pressure and stress, and then share that with each other, because everybody has a different response. So that's the first thing. The second thing is practice. And there's no better way to practice than starting the meeting to say, okay, so what's everybody thinking and feeling at the moment about this work? And you spend 10 minutes at the beginning of say a 2-3 hour meeting, which is so worthwhile in recognizing that people are in very different places with this work and may need help and support that they don't think they can get, or the team might need to go outside the team to get. So there's something about making sure that connection is secure and helps people speak up. And there's a question also about any tips to manage defensiveness when one does speak up. I think the curiosity that I mentioned earlier is a tool, and you can also start by saying, this is what I intend by what I'm just about to say, and this is what I do not intend by it, and then pose it as a question. I'm wondering if we looked at it this way, whether actually our response would be different. And I think that's a really useful way of defusing defensiveness. And I think if it is, I mean, everybody is subject to defensiveness one way and another, because we're defending our competency. And if we're, particularly at work, and if we're felt to be less competent by others, or if we perceive that, we're going to feel damaged. It strikes quite deeply. So being able to say, this is not about your professional competence, but I'm wondering whether we could see it a different way, and maybe that can unlock a way forward for you. That kind of thing, I think, really helpful. But again, great question, as Brendan was saying. I'm going to move us on, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Because I'm aware of time. So I'm going to go back to sharing. And again, I'm going to move through these reasonably briefly. So keep an eye on the questions that you want and just pop them in the question box there, and we can come back to them. So the next question we've got is, how will we work together? Now, this is a much more day-to-day question, but still an important one that individuals ask when they come into a team. How are we going to arrange ourselves? What roles are we going to play? Who does what? And how are we going to interact together? What behaviours are going to be helpful to us? How much are we going to challenge and support each other? If we're trying to do something difficult together, that's going to be very helpful. How will decisions be made? These are important questions. How will we make the most of the diversity of opinion, experience, background, context, culture? How will we make all of those differences work hard? Because we're missing out if we're not making that work hard. And you can even come to some kind of a charter that includes how you're going to work together as real intention, so that you can keep on coming back to it. And then next up, we have results. And the question that relates to results is, what does success look like? And success is not just about performance or output. It's about attending to the needs of those who are stakeholders to your team, your clients, your customers, other teams who you're going to need to engage with, perhaps more closely in some cases than sometimes your own team members. So what does success look like for them as well as for you? And is it just about that output and outcome, or is it also about how the team will feel and what they'll think as a result of the success and achievement? Because those are outcomes just as much as they are inputs to effective delivery. So that's the next question. And then I'm going to layer a couple of questions on top of this whole approach. We have the questions that we've just gone through, those 4 central questions. And then you see leadership and learning there that kind of bring it all together. The question that relates to leadership is, what is the leader's role here? What can I expect from the leader? And if I'm the leader, what can I expect from my team? And is that articulated? And finally, on learning, how will we learn? And how will we learn together over time? Because often the most effective teams that we work with have a rhythm, a learning rhythm that sits alongside their operational rhythm. So it's not just about what have we done, what do we need to improve? It's, okay, so what have we learned in the last month, year, however long it's been? What have we learned on this project? What are we learning about ourselves and our ability to deliver? What are we learning about this particular client? What are we learning about these contractors who we're engaging? These are central questions. And if you put in place a rhythm in time to punctuate the period you're going to be together, it'll be enormously helpful. And it'll be time absolutely worth spending. So learning and leadership. And just a few more words on leadership. I've come back to that. We have a way of looking at leadership that poses a question to leaders where they are spending most of their time. And it's a proposition that a leader's role in a team is composed of 3 areas. One is leadership, because that helps people understand why they've come together. So that's the first question we looked at. Then it's management, and that's, what are we going to be doing? But that's more about helping the team comply within a set of boundaries and guidelines. So that's objective setting, it's plans, it's strategies, it's all of those good things. And those two things need to be in place for the third bit to really work well, and that's coaching. And that's the leader's role in supporting and challenging team members to play their best game, to do their best, to contribute the kind of things that they fully can contribute, and to find meaning in the work as well. And that's really about learning. So that's a quick word about the role of the leader, but of course, in a team, very often we are all leaders. So those are the questions that I've come to, and I've got one passing shot that perhaps I can pause on before we open it up for more questions. So let me see if I can stop sharing there. And Guy, do you want to come back in and we can harvest some more questions?
Yes. So another question that we had, or not a question, maybe an observation about loving the shift of perspective from my typical end of project wash up about what we have learned about this and that. And it seems a great way to continue a professional relationship growth throughout the team.
Yeah, I think that's a very well made point, Ben. And we work a lot in the oil and gas sector, and they for years have wrestled with safety. Safety is one of the most important things in your organization, and particularly, of course, for oil and gas. And there are very dangerous situations you can put yourself into, and learning from those situations where things have not gone so well is critical. But of course, if you go in with a heavy hand and look for the guilty and punish the innocent, as the saying goes, then you're not going to get anywhere. Nobody's going to tell you next time if things are just about to go wrong. It'll damage the culture, in that psychological safety will be impaired. So I think you make a very good point, particularly about learning from projects, particularly what's gone well, actually. And that's often not a question that's asked. What's gone really well, and how do we create that success? Great point.
I think that's a great point, David, that maybe is worth drilling in a little bit deeper. It feels like the go-to process is what went wrong, how can we make it better?
Yes.
And that's often not as effective as these things we did fantastically. How do we do more of that?
Yes, I think there's a Western gravitational pull towards fixing things. Dare I say it, it's quite a male approach. It's very singular. It's step-like rather than in circles, and I'll come and talk about that in a moment. And it doesn't see learning as an iterative process, where sometimes you just have to declare you don't know. I think we have that quite well embedded in our education system in this country, because the prize always goes for the person who puts their hand up, often puts their hand up first and who knows, rather than the person who's sitting in the back going, that's a really interesting question, but you could see that in a whole variety of different ways. That's a much more interesting kind of set of thoughts that are going on there. Now you want to get that person in the conversation, because they can bring challenge that the person who put their hand up first, just doesn't have that perspective. And that's also on the edge of the diversity challenge that we all have in organizations. We want the decisions that we make to be much more effective, and you can only get that if you get diverse opinions, attitudes, beliefs, values, often backgrounds, experiences. So all of that is highly relevant, and you've got to be alive to that.
And that feels like it taps into what you were discussing about a place being safe, which will then encourage people to show their difference of opinion, their thought process, which will then enrich the team.
Absolutely. And it only takes one or two times for that person who's been a bit quieter at the back of the room, but who's thinking some brilliant thoughts, to be welcomed into the conversation, for them to really contribute, because we learn quickly. So it goes back to what we were saying about consequence. I'll learn really quickly if I'm beaten to a pulp every time I open my mouth. I won't do it more than twice. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. We have a. Sorry, go ahead, David.
No, I noticed the question earlier on about introverts and extroverts for leaders.
Absolutely, yes. We'll come back to that in a sec. There was also a question from Efran about having people understand that we can all be leaders is so important and empowering from top to bottom.
Yeah.
How can this be emphasized by senior leaders and shown to be important?
I think it's in the way that they behave, and the way that, it's the old adage, people always forget what you said, but they remember how they made you feel. And I think the great leaders that I've come across do that. And to the point later on, they do give a sense of they ignite personal power in those who want to say something, who do have great contributions to make, but who've maybe been either quiet or reserved or holding on to things or not feeling like they have the latitude to act. So I think great leaders do that by the way that they are, the way that they show up, not just what they say. But of course, you have to do things to demonstrate that. It's not good enough to say, and when the classic is, my door is always open, which means my mind is always closed. And mostly people work in open space these days. So that metaphor, is doubly poor.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, that's one of the things I made a point for myself, a certain lip service that sometimes is used, encapsulated in that sentence. It's an open door policy. You can ask whatever you like, but if you don't back that up with actions, then it's an empty gesture.
Absolutely. And if your behavior, when people do come into your room, metaphorically or actually, and they say, could I have a few minutes? And you say, not now, I'm going by. They won't come again. They won't come again. And if they wanted to say to you, I just want to say that the building's on fire, probably you should have paid attention.
Yeah. And it could be, the best, either the next big idea or a way of improving the team or something that you hadn't thought about, but you'll never hear, because if that person is burnt once, maybe twice, that will be the end of it.
Absolutely.
And it's probably harder to recover if trust or there's a sense of lack of safety, psychological safety. It's harder to try and re-engage that person.
It is, it's more difficult to backtrack. So having some clear, helpful intentions that are consistent with the way you want the team to go and how you want team members to show up as leaders themselves, the better. But you've got to be clear on your intention in doing that. And it's got to be about helping them learn and perform to their best.
Thank you. Also, there was a question, as you picked up, about briefly about whether a leader is better as an introvert or extrovert.
Well, the popular press would have you believe that being an extrovert is the most important thing in a leader. And it is, in the West, again, I'm going to make this distinction, in the West, extroverts are prized and probably promoted ahead of introverts. And there are lots of different ways of assessing personality, but across all of the different measures, extroverts are seen as more leaderful than introverts. But that doesn't mean to say they're better. And over the last few years, we've had a glorious procession of highly extrovert folks who've had fundamental personality flaws that should have barred them from leadership. and no doubt they were surrounded by other extroverts because they promoted in their own likeness. And both sides of the pond, we were in a right mess. So I may have been stretching all the way to politics there. However, I think there is something in that. I think we're learning a lot more about and being aware in teams, actually, that because you're thinking about it first and waiting until your own mind is clear, and that the questions you have are going to be clear to others, has real value. And in a team, if people don't speak up, and that's not the only dimension of being an introvert, of course, but it is one of the most popularly known and one that's most observable often. If there are people in your team who are speaking less, or who are usually speaking last, then bring them in. Just you can do it gently. I noticed you haven't spoken. It'd be great to hear. Or what do you think? And they may say, "I've got to think about it," and that should be okay. There's also something about preparing for things like meetings that's also hugely important for introverts. And the introverts that I know who lead teams are very well prepared because they have thought about things. They may not have made a final judgment or decision, but they know which questions to pose to their team. And I think there's real value in that. So, and I see a switch, actually. I see more introverts who are leaders of teams now than I have done in the past. I think there is a cultural shift, and that comes from our ability to be aware of the value of both.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I wanted to pick up on something that you said earlier. You mentioned the phrase teamship. Can you elaborate a little bit what you mean by teamship?
Yes, so teamship is our way of encapsulating all the things that individual leaders need to be able to do to engage effectively with teams, whether they're a team member or a team leader, and also how those team members can engage effectively beyond their team boundary, with other teams and even with other organizations. Do they have those base skills that are contained in the adaptable team framework to be able to engage effectively and respond to shifting context? Because context is always shifting. In your business, no doubt, some of the news that was top of mind for you, for some of you in the audience, no doubt, was shifting government policy towards net zero, announced this morning. So that has a knock-on effect. So being able to raise those questions and say in a team, engage with the consequences in order that you can be prepared is enormously helpful. And all of that is encapsulated in teamwork. It's our ability to function effectively in complex, fast-moving situations.
And it also feels like this is a thread that you mentioned before, and is in fact embedded in your framework. It's the importance of being adaptable.
Absolutely right. But there is one kind of thread that I just want to throw in there, and I know we're just in the last kind of closing moments, but it's to slow down to speed up. Because the more we can give time to the conversations that we've been talking about today, the more we will have the opportunity to make better decisions and not be caught in a short-term trap of just tweaking the actions to get better results. No, let's go back to team dynamics. Let's go back to purpose and meaning, because these things have a fundamental effect on the quality of the actions you take and therefore the results that you get. So that's my passing shot.
Fantastic. And I could probably go on. There was another thing that I wanted to pick up. You mentioned in the research that you referred to earlier about what does a team need over time, and also it feels like time is an important function.
Yeah.
What is the time frame? What is the importance of time, do you think?
Well, we have a whole load of different perceptions of time. Our brains do keep time. Our brains have an internal clock, if you like, a sense of time passing, but it's connected to daylight and nighttime. So if we're deprived of that, we lose our sense of time. In an organization, you have to punctuate the open space of time with, well, we do it through the seasons, we do it through holidays, we do it through celebrations that are national. But in a business, you have to carve it up again into quarters, into months, into a series of rhythmic sessions, meetings, in order that you can make sense of what has happened and therefore learn and go again. And that's the active, proactive use of time. And I think if folks in the audience are saying, well, you know, it'd be great questions, but I just don't have time to ask them. Well, I don't think you have time not to ask them, and you don't have to do it all in one go. You spend 5 minutes at the beginning of a meeting checking in with people. You know, how are you? What did you do at the weekend? That connects you as human beings. That's enormously helpful. So slow down to speed up and use time to your advantage. Don't let time use you. I can think of millions of conversations that I have with my colleagues in preparing for sometimes some quite challenging situations with clients that basically make it significantly quicker to design something because we've unlocked our relationship with this client, and it suddenly becomes quicker and easier to do. And yet, if we hadn't had that conversation, we'd have found it really difficult, like walking through sludge. So I think that's a personal example of, I think, what happens very often. If you don't have the conversation, you've got it locked in your head, it's going to be a barrier, even if you're aware of it, or even if you're not aware of it.
Yeah, it feels like the purpose, the intention, setting certain setting your stall, you know, as a team, it feels a little bit wishy-washy. But once that sort of conceptual level is set,
Mm-hmm.
it means that everybody is synced. Everybody knows what they're working with.
Yeah.
And maybe you only need to do it once, and maybe that's, you know, the 10, 15, 20 minutes that it'll take.
Yeah.
And that will set you up for,
Yeah.
you know, a month. And maybe, as you said, again, maybe things change and that needs to be done again.
Yeah. Well,
but
as any good therapist will tell you, you've got to do the work.
Yeah.
Otherwise things won't get any better. And the
Absolutely.
work is actually, in a therapist context, in your life, but in a team, it's, you've got to have the conversation. You can't avoid having the conversation because things will only get worse. They won't magically get better. You've got to do the work.
And how do you know? How does either a team leader or the team members, how do you know when something is potentially going to go wrong and one needs to have the conversations?
Well, I think there's some outer kind of material you can look at. You know, what are people looking like when they're working? Are they looking at those so they're sweating every moment, or are they fully joyful and breezing through it? So there's some observation about individuals, but also observation about the work. What are the results looking like? Is there an anticipation of results dropping off at some point? Do you have enough resources to keep going in the same direction? So that's an outer game kind of set of observations. But the inner game set of observations is much more about how people are thinking and feeling. And you can only get there through conversation. You can infer what might be going on inside somebody's head, but you don't know for sure. You never know for sure. You have to ask them. And we're very good in this country at not telling people the truth when they ask simple questions like, how are you? And we've got to get out of that habit in a team. You've got to say, no, I really want to know the answer, because it's material to our work together. Because if you're just about to keel over, I got to know because I'm relying on you. And I think having those kind of conversations is at a premium, particularly if you're trying to do high pace, high stakes, difficult work. You've got to have those central conversations, and it makes decision making so much easier. And it cuts the legs off any dark dynamic that may emerge, because people know that they can have an open conversation if things don't go so well.
And I think once that layer of connection is established, all other interactions, team interactions, are elevated.
Yeah. Because
if the team is linked and connected and in tune with each other,
yeah,
then that's such a strong base to start from.
It really is. It really is. And it becomes much more enjoyable. And, you know, God knows we need enjoyment these days.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, David. It's been absolutely fascinating. So unless I'm aware that we've gone past the hour, but it feels like many people are still with us. Unless there are other questions, I will draw this to a close. Great feedback from everyone. Thank you very much. Any last words, David?
Well, I'm going to put in a bit of a plug for my book, because remembering Blackadder, the famous quote about, I think George says, I didn't know you'd been that interested. I didn't want to, you know, blow my own trumpet. And I think Blackadder says, at least you could have let us know you had a trumpet. So,
indeed.
This is the book. It is on Amazon, and do have a look. It was interesting writing it, and I gather it's an interesting read as well. And it talks about all the different parts of the model and gives you lots of hints and tips. But thank you very much for inviting me along. I've really enjoyed it and enjoyed the conversation, guys. So thank you, and all the questions. Thank you as well out there in the ether. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a lovely day. Hope to see you in one of the other events. Take care. Ciao, ciao.